Hey guys, it's Sean here, Micro Budget Film Lab, and I wanted to give you a little video talking a little bit more about character. I know you've been doing a lot of work. You've been working on those Truby spreadsheets that I uploaded, and probably going to get me sued. I'm sure John Truby right now is talking to his lawyers, but I'm not profiting from this. I'm giving it away, so you won't be able to get any money out of me anyway. But I wanted to add some things to it because the Truby spreadsheet is awesome. But I feel it leaves out a couple important elements, not too much more work. I know this is a lot of groundwork that I'm giving you, but trust me, this is so going to pay off for you when you sit down to write and you know the world and the characters super well that you're going to, it's going to be a breeze. You're not going to suffer writer's block in the drafting process when you've got this much preparation going on. So, but in terms of the things that I feel are left out, some of them are general character things that I find are useful when I'm constructing the final elements of a character in a story. And some of them are specific to the film form itself. The Truby sheets are very much about story in general as opposed to film story that you get from, say, Save the Cat or Sid Field or any of those kinds of writing books that are out there. So the first thing that I may have mentioned, but it's worth mentioning again with characters, is that often we struggle with the fact that we want our characters to be likable, which is not a bad thing. We want people to connect with them. We want to feel. It's not necessarily that characters need to be likable as they need to be charismatic. We need to be drawn to them. But people will often they identify with the characters and they want the characters to be likable, and so they will do two things, one of which I'll talk about later in relationship to dialogue and characters, and the other is in relationship to how we construct the characters themselves, is that we want to make them not too screwed up. We want them to be like, the example I used to give was about, somebody's a coffee drinker, and it's like, well, George drinks too much coffee. He has really 3 or 4 cups a day, even though it upsets his stomach and gives him a headache sometimes, but he continues to do it. And that's not really engaging. It's not engaging in two senses. One, because everybody kind of does that, or a lot of people do that, but and it's not a very extreme thing, so it's kind of like, watching somebody wash their clothes. But the other thing is you want the journey that they travel from point A at the beginning to point B, or C or whatever at the end, to be as difficult and as extreme as possible so that you're testing your hypothesis, that is your theme, in the most harsh ways. When we do the scientific method, when we're doing an experiment, we want to find the ways to negate our hypothesis about whatever it is we're experimenting on. And so we want to do the same thing by giving them the hardest challenge possible. And part of that is not only the obstacles that they overcome, but the distance that they have to travel. So we want George to not just drink 2 or 3 cups too many in the course of a day. We want him to be like, if his struggle is to overcome coffee addiction, he needs to be like crazy for coffee. He needs to sell, force his kids to get jobs to pay for his coffee habit. He needs to burn down his house for the insurance money for the coffee habit. He needs to lose his job because he's been smuggling coffee out of work by pouring it into condoms and swallowing it. Like, you need to make him like so extreme on the coffee thing that then his need to overcome to become not addicted to coffee by the end is a good journey to travel, and there'll be more obstacles for him to overcome than simply like, oh well, he drinks 4 cups a day and so instead he switched to chamomile tea, and now he's a much calmer person who has more friends and is not going to die of hypertension at the age of 41. So we just need to keep that kind of thing in mind. Now, the second thing is in relationship to dialogue, because often what happens, and it kind of relates to the film form in terms of character representation in general. Often what happens is I'll read scripts from people, and their antagonists will be really interesting and engaging, and they'll have very specific character traits to them. They'll be like, oh yeah, I can describe this antagonist they throw temper tantrums, they whine, they have a desperate addiction to coffee, to sardines, or they desperately want to get this do this thing, take over the world or whatever, and they're very clear. And then the protagonists, I'll be like, the good guys in the story, and then be say the hero and the hero's boyfriend or girlfriend, the boss of the hero, the whatever, they'll all kind of sound the same, and I'll be unable to differentiate one from the other, and I'll be thinking, oh, man, these people are kind of boring, and the most interesting person is either the antagonist or sometimes the secondary characters. And in part that's because I believe we don't want our characters to be nasty human beings. We want them to be good people. And who are good people? Presumably you think that you're a good person. And so what ends up happening is, automatically, because you haven't prepared and thought about the details of how to represent the character beforehand, they sound like you. And everybody who's good sounds like you. It's like being John Malkovich, It's like everybody's John Malkovich in this world. And so you don't want, unless you're, Charlie Kaufman, and you're writing a crazy surreal satire like being John Malkovich, you don't want everybody to sound the same. You want them to have distinctive characteristics. And that leads to the film side of this, which is that the film side of film representation in books, for instance, when we represent characters, they can be represented in terms of internal characteristics, their internal narrative, how they think about themselves, how they're troubled by an event that's happening outside the world. But in cinema, we can't really see that. Sometimes you have voiceover, but by and large, you only can know people by how they act in the world. And so it's really useful to think of the physical manifestations of character, and the way that they represent their internal struggles in terms of the world. So if somebody is incredibly introverted or shy, if they're shy, which is different than introverted, if they're incredibly shy, they maybe, when they talk, they look at their feet and they mumble. Do they talk fast? Do they talk slow? So these are kinds of important details that you need to know. Are they a compulsive person? In which ways do they represent their compulsiveness? Because it'll also be an expression of their character's need and the way that they need to transform themselves. So somebody, for instance, could be obsessive in that they check all the plugs around their house 5 or 6 times to make sure they're not heating up before they can leave the house. And then they walk down the hall and they come back and they check, did they really lock the door? They thought they locked the door, but they don't really trust themselves. So they go back and they checked again. Then they walk down the hall of the elevator and then they go back and they check the plugs again, because did they really check the plugs? That kind of OCD behavior, versus somebody who, say, while you're having lunch with them, they're eating food off your plate because they have a hunger that they need to deal with. So you want to find those and write down, make a list of the physical manifestations of them. Do they smoke, chain smoke? Do they, have a tendency to lose their temper really quickly? And so they yell, as soon as they're challenged in the most minimal of ways. Oh, Hank, your tie is a little crooked. You want me to? Why are you telling me my tie is crooked? Why are you persecuting me? Like, do they have a persecution complex? And how is it manifested? Because you can't just leave it at that. And sometimes the Truby stuff can be left at the internal manifestations of their struggle. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is creating a mini bio. So you probably have a lot of those elements in the Truby sheet. You'll have some of those now in the ways that I've talked about, the kind of physical manifestations of their internal lack, the thing that they need to overcome, and their external manifestations of their character. And I find it extremely useful at this point, before I finally go, is to write little bios. It doesn't have to be like a 10-page book, but just like a page or two on each of the main characters and their relationship to each other. And that stuff is going to start to come up with details. Now, the danger with all this, when you write mini bios in particular, is that you feel you have to use them all. And the bios, by the way, should include life history bios, what they do for a living, that kind of thing, but also the things that they do in private when nobody is looking at them. Do they hum to themselves in the shower? Do they, what do they think about, or who do they think about when they masturbate? Do they masturbate? Maybe they don't masturbate. Do they chew with their mouth open when they're at home versus when they're out? They always chew with their mouth closed. Coming up with those kinds of, again, physical, visual details. But the danger is that with this incredibly useful tool is that it's so useful that you want to use it everywhere in your story, and you have to pick and choose the biographical details of their lives about how they lost their doll when they were young and their dad flew into a rage and threw out all their dolls because to teach them a lesson about taking care of their things. And then they talk about this, they do what's called by Epstein in his book Crafty Screenwriting. He talks about the rubber ducky moment, where in a story somebody, somewhere the moment of pause in the second act, maybe 2/3 of the way through, stops and talks about that time that their dad threw out all their toys, and it's this like expository moment 2/3 of the way through the movie, talking about how they lost the rubber ducky and they've never liked to take baths ever since, or whatever it is, and it just feels like this information dump. So you don't need to necessarily use that stuff. You have it there as a treasure chest of material you can use, but don't feel like you need to use it all. Write it and then put it aside, and don't have it in front of you as a guide. It's just part of your memory and the texture of the world and the texture of your character that you're going to have. And I think that when you've got that Truby material and now this biographical, concretized and summarized material, and a list of some of the character manifestations, physical manifestations of character, then I think you're going to be able to create distinct, differentiated characters that will be engaging and that people will not forget about the moment that they put down the page and wonder what the whole deal is, why we're watching Louise and her interest in whatever, building a rocket ship. So I hope that helps you out, and hope everything's going well with your planning your script. Bye for now.